Okay, today's episode / video is on why the West needs an embodied practice. So, it's my belief that we very, very badly need a paradigm of physical education that includes the somatic, that includes character development in the West. So, I'm going to, over the next 30 minutes or so, lay out kind of where there used to be one, what happened, why it went wrong, where is it now, why is that a problem, some comparisons with Asia, blah, 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 why this is needed. Okay. So the normal view of education we'd have probably today is that it's about getting information in people's heads. This is fundamentally a mistake and is actually a huge shift from how education was viewed in the past, which was a way to install values and a way to create character. Now, if you use a phrase like character building in England today, and probably America, most Western countries, it seems kind of old-fashioned. It seems like almost Victorian. So this idea did exist in the past and has existed in the West if we go as far back to the ancient Greeks. So something like the academy or the gymnasium, these were places where the distinction between the ethical education, moral education, we could say, again, sounds old-fashioned, right? And physical education and cognitive education, those things were intertwined. Those things weren't seem separate. The gymnasium wasn't just somewhere where people worked out physically. Philosophers would go to the gymnasium. Even until relatively recently, I would say, these things were intertwined in, say, modern sports. So there's this saying that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. What does that mean? So Battle of Waterloo, British military victory against Napoleon. Playing fields at Eton. So the school sports played by, in that case, the officer class of the British military were responsible not just for physical fitness of those officers, but for developing their character, their coordinating, their ability to be leaders, to be courageous, to communicate, etc., etc. And if you look at the genesis of modern sports, it wasn't as a form of entertainment or physical exercise. That was very secondary. There's a reason that football comes from Cambridge University. It was literally invented on the park in Cambridge, near where I grew up, actually. Rugby, that you've probably heard of, obviously ruined when it became American football, but the precursor to American football comes from rugby, which is a school like Eton. It's a British fee-paying school, kind of upper classes. Harrow also very involved in many sports. These were considered character-building activities. And if you, someone like Gordonstone, where, the current king went, for example, early morning runs, cold showers, these things, though more modern in some ways, they came from some proto sort of German romantic back to nature type hippies. They were also considered character building. So in the lineage of the ancient Greeks, the idea that the body is used to develop the person, as opposed to being an entirely separate thing that's used for physical fitness, and that's about it. So sports have degraded, however, in the West, so that we no longer look up to, football stars, sports stars, baseball stars as sort of paradigms of good character, good citizenship, the Greeks might have said. In fact, that's a bit of a joke when we look at the average, American football player or British Premiership soccer player. It's the American. So these things have become disconnected. However, we do see a continuous attempt to rebirth this. As soon as you work with the body, you can't just work with the body as a piece of meat. The Greeks would call that sarx, as opposed to soma, the body as part of a key integral part of who we are. You can never really do that, however. So whenever you do physical things, the heroic emerges. You'll see this in World Cups and football and various other things. It also emerges in those who do these activities. So many people who do sports at a high level, or even at an amateur level, will find there's a degree of transcendence that occurs. Altered states are very, very common amongst, say, NFL athletes and NBA athletes. Studies of this, very, very common. Altered states, transcendent states, super common. So you kind of can't stop the super normal emerging. Also, you'll see this in all kinds of culture where, people will surf, but then they'll develop this kind of nature, sort of pagan-y nature work. You'll see this in all the extreme sports that idea that it's somehow connecting you to nature and characters coming out. Well, this is a re-emergence of this kind of German romantic ideal that I hinted to earlier. The hippies, by the way, the original hippies were founded from German immigrants to California. This comes from a sort of German romantic movement who would go off in the woods and believed in free love, and things like Steiner schools you'll get across Europe are a result of this. Forest schools, very much nature connected, but also body connected. They develop practice like eurythmy, for example. So this pretty kind of old school versions of this. And of course, these could be distorted. In fact, the Nazis did distort some of this into in the Germanic, Teutonian kind of warrior, like all things can be distorted. However, that's another European tradition, and then you will see something similar come out in surfing, extreme sports, even like weightlifting. You'll see gym bros on TikTok and YouTube and Instagram talking about how building weight builds character. And you'll see, the people on Joe Rogan talking about doing difficult things, the cold showers, the weightlifting, the jujitsu. They're looking for a way of understanding character development because they see it happening. In the martial arts that have come to us, people see the character development through that. They see the character development of doing difficult things that go against the grain, whether it be fasting, weightlifting, cold showers, whatever. They see that Western man, this is really the crux of why we need this. Western man, the Western person is in many ways decadent. We have too easy a life. Soft times are creating weak men. We live in a world where we can flick a switch and get electricity, hot water. Even compared to my parents, let alone my grandparents, who are in World War II, there's a huge difference in the level of resilience and robustness. The huge difference in the level of comfort and ease that we have. And unfortunately, that ease and comfort is wonderful. Of course, I love it. Warm house right now, it's quite nice. Got a belly full of food. It's quite nice. But it makes us weak. So only by deliberately exposing ourselves systematically to things that are difficult do we actually overcome that weakness and ironically enjoy our lives more. The other path is the sort of the path of the decadent drug addict or something. And I've tried that and it doesn't lead to happiness and meaning. Let me tell you that. So the West is in this position where it's decadent, where we don't really need to use our bodies for most of us. Most of us have jobs that are, service industry, information industry that don't involve our bodies. It's quite funny, actually. You go to a modern gym and you've got people doing what looks to me like farm labor, like hitting things with hammers and moving tires and shit I used to do as a farmhand when I was growing up in East Anglia. So kind of paying to do manual labor is quite funny. Because they realize that we need something. But there isn't really a sophisticated paradigm for thinking about this. So again, intuitively, anyone with half a brain, Joe Rogan's, the people he has on, they look at this and they go, well, obviously there's something that's in this. So who has a good paradigm? Well, there's a few out there. So traditionally, Asia, okay? So while embodied practices to develop the person have existed in all societies, tribal societies, maybe needed them less because people were hunting, fishing, running around in the woods, whatever, in Native Americans, Africans, etc. But what many societies found, and particularly in Asia, is when agriculture happened, certain sophistication. In Japan, it was the period of peace. They had all these samurai battling, and they realized this was a bad thing, because there's murder and death and chaos. However, they realized it created strong men, created strong citizens, strong people, like the Greeks also worked this out. But they went, well, how do we do this when we're in time of peace? And the Japanese created Budo. And there are equivalent concepts in Korea and China. The idea of martial arts as a way to develop oneself, the famous Shaolin monks and, modern Taekwondo movement in Korea. And this was formed when we went, hang on a minute. We need to build character through difficult experience, through embodied experience, through embodied learning. And it became normal. So in Japan, for example, I believe still to this day, every school child does kendo or judo. Traditionally, young ladies, for example, did archery and something called naginata, which is like spear work. It was considered almost like a finishing school for young ladies. So even, women and kind of quite posh levels, but certainly for the average person, that Japanese spirit, the Japanese have this notion of being Japanese, which they're not ashamed of. They don't have some kind of weird post-colonial guilt. though they certainly did plenty of atrocities in World War II. So, they've got as much reason as anyone. But they have this idea of being Japanese. They're proud of being Japanese, and that they build that Japanese spirit. And they do that in all sorts of ways, everything from cleaning their schools. But physical education is, in fact, somatic education. It's not just physical. When you do a Japanese martial art, they don't really care about fighting. It's a pretty safe country. They're not that interested in fighting. They're interested in the refinement of character. And that is a lifelong pursuit. So when I went to what's called the Honbu Dojo of Aikido in Tokyo, in Shinjuku, you see old men who have been coming every morning at 6:30 a.m. for 40 years to practice. They're really refining themselves, polishing themselves. They're not interested in wrist locks or arm locks or throws. They're not trying to be in the UFC, or they're not a bouncer. They're just working on themselves and their spirit. So this doesn't, yes, it's for school kids, but it continues. For school kids, we do have a bit of a parallel in the West, which is outdoor education. So following a little bit of that Germanic tradition, includes some traditional things like archery, climbing, things we might have found in the Greeks, not so much fighting, martial arts, but outdoor arts. I worked in that field for some years and worked with children, and you'd see their characters develop, and school teachers would be amazed, and parents would be amazed, and be like, wow, little Johnny's really flourishing, even though he doesn't sitting in a classroom. Wow, wonderful. Again, the nature element, but also the challenge element, the Absel Tower that little Johnny's scared of, he overcomes his fear. That's an emotional education. It's an emotional education. It's a character education. It's just a tiny part, though. Maybe British schools, where I think they do once a year some form of outdoor education in certain years. It's a small amount to it. It's lip service, but the Outward Bound or the PGLs, they're kind of like a bit like Camp America, but through the school system. Camp America would be another one. Yeah. So there are these equivalents. Oh, one more, the scouting movement. So this again tried to create through physical skills, again, not so much combative skills, but certainly physical, certainly exercise, certainly the outdoors and crafts, working with one's hands, making things, blah, blah, blah. They also had the idea of service to that, which I think, any good character development art has these components. Physical, something physical that involves the body. This brings the cognitive Western man, cognitive Western person. And the beauty and the weak point of Western culture, there's a couple, but one is it's hypocognocentric. Is that a word? I think I made that up. The idea that we're over-emphasized on the mind. Our education is about reading books. We're hyperlogical. It might not seem that way at times, but one of the more logical cultures out there. We think of information and knowledge in this very cognitive way. And that has been a strength, but also becomes, when it's focused on this entirety, a weakness. Certainly a weakness when it has a sort of postmodern turn of very cognitive, I identify as this, identify as that, these sort of very cognitive identities, which are disconnected from physicality. By definition, identify something because I feel that way, rather than I am physically that thing. Huge weakness of the West, huge weakness of the West. The other huge weakness of the West is because the West believes in diversity and always has to some degree, that it takes ideas from elsewhere. Part of that can be very healthy, taking on ideas and concepts and learning from different places. A certain amount of variety is certainly a healthy thing, whether that be genetically or culturally, everyone agrees with food, blah, blah, blah. However, it can turn into a kind of self-hatred. And there's this very weird kind of post-colonial guilt in Western countries, even ones that didn't have colonies, like Denmark for some reason, where most young people are educated by a sort of far-left, neo-Marxist education system. Essentially, it's taken over the social sciences, what's called the Long March through the universities of Marxism. And this is not just my opinion. There's studies of the political leanings of professors, and the social sciences are vast majority hard left. And this idea is really that the West's bad, that it's a patriarchy, that it needs smashing, that it's bad. So why would you have any practice which developed the values of the West when it's considered a bad thing, or maybe just sort of on lighter levels, slightly cringe? Yeah. And in Europe, this is particularly the case because of the sort of World War II hangover. So obviously, World War II, we saw nationalism go to diabolical heights. A healthy love of one's culture can become a kind of genocidal racism. We saw that. In Japan, so not just the West, but definitely saw it obviously in Nazi Germany. And this idea of the state, the Soviet state, began being genocidal. So Europe's left with this huge hangover where it is scared of any kind of positive identification. This is why you don't see people waving flags in Germany to this day. Occasionally, if the football's on, and even that's a bit shocking to older people. Yeah. So what does that mean? It means we're disconnected from our values. We don't fight for our values. We don't believe in our values. I'm actually, today, I happen to be wearing a T-shirt. A Ukrainian refugee student of mine, she's in Belgium, she came from one of my courses, she gave me this. And it occurred to me in Ukraine, people are really fighting to be part of the West and to be Ukrainian. And no, that doesn't make them Nazis. No, they're not horrible racists. They're all left-leaning. My friends are from Ukraine. However, they believe in the West and they believe it's worth fighting for. And, they're really putting their lives on the line for that. And even the ones who aren't on the front line, there's a deep commitment. My friends who are trauma therapists out there, there's a deep commitment to the nation and healing and supporting a Western way. Like the reason they like the trauma work that I taught them in Ukraine is that they saw it as something Western as opposed to Russian or Chinese, the other major power blocks in the world, which, by the way, they're the real alternatives to the West. It's like, do you want to learn to be Western, to reinforce those values, to fight for those values, to deepen those values, to educate young people and even older people in those values? Or do you want to be Chinese or Russian? They're your basic options, right? I know which I choose. There is this weird contradiction, actually, that people in the West all believe in Western values. If you said to them, would you like to live in Saudi Arabia or Iran, and they would say no. If you said, hey, do you want the values towards women or homosexuality in Iran or Saudi Arabia, they would say no. So they do believe in Western values. They do want Western things. We believe in logic and reason. Like if we want our medical choices to be informed by that. We want in a court of law there to be evidence. We don't want that to be corrupt, right? The rule of law, very Western thing. You won't find that in a lot of the world. That's not as culturally embedded in the Arab world, sub-Saharan African world. It's just not. What's our praxis? We can talk about this. You could read books on this. You could read, I don't know, Douglas's Murray's War on the West and Jordan Peterson or something and decide that Western culture was great. And that's cognitively deciding it. How do you get that in your bones, though? Yeah. So it's my belief that a praxis is a German word. So a physical practice which develops a way of being, an embodied praxis, is necessary for the West. And one could, I'm looking at what that might look like. I don't think it's one thing. I think it's a framework that one would apply to the things that you're already doing. So it could be your jiu-jitsu, your weightlifting, your cold exposure. It's also having an understanding of embodied skills. So how does one develop oneself through embodied training? Well, first, you need a good model of what developing oneself is, right? Like, what the fuck is that? Developing yourself. It's very abstract. Whereas I can break that down. I have a model of embodied intelligence. And we'd say, okay, it's looking at self-awareness, increasing that can get better or worse. Looking at self-regulation, that can get better or worse. Looking at empathy and listening, that can get better or worse. Impact and influence, that can get better or worse. These are concrete skill sets that can be developed through embodied practices. I think just having this framework of I'm developing myself according to a set of values. Now, it doesn't have to be, some hardcore nationalistic set of values. And there's always a risk in that, right? Like things can be misused. Like the Japanese martial arts, along with Zen, were horribly misused by the Japanese imperial government around the 1930s and 40s. Absolutely atrocious how the martial arts and Zen were used to reinforce a very cruel, racist Japanese way of looking at the world. Yeah. You might say the same thing from a lesser extent from some British school system, for example. So it's no doubt things can be used or misused, but I think consciously bringing a set of principles where we understand that embodiment is a thing, embodied practice is a thing, and boy, do we need one in the West. Boy, do we need to, I think we can reclaim the sports we already play. I think we can look at sort of PE teachers in school, a lot of them kind of have a sense of this. They just don't really quite have a rigorous model for what they're doing. They just somehow it's good for kids to play football in the rain or something. They don't really get it. But I think being explicit about that, saying we are teaching resilience, we are teaching, these skills, team building, communication, self-expression through dance, for example. There could be a whole spectrum here. As one that's not in the Japanese martial arts, for example, self-expression, beautiful part of Western tradition to express oneself, and well worth developing. You can get better or worse at that. So there's a few thoughts. Currently developing one, talking to various people about this. If you're interested in the conversation, get in touch. Just beginning to know what that would look like. I think because of the work I've done in embodiment, I'm kind of ahead of the game on this. There's a few others like John Viveki, who I think are also thinking about it, a few others. But they're my thoughts for now. My conclusion is really the West desperately needs an embodied practice that does embody its values. And we need to have this conversation so that is possible with the things we're doing, whatever they are. Mark Walsh here. If you like that, you'll probably like embodimentunlimited.com and our app. So on both of these things, you can get a bunch of podcasts that aren't available here, and some exclusive ones with some big names, some people you'll probably recognize that are over there. There's a copy of my book, PDF of my first book on embodiment, which seems to people like. I sold quite a few copies on Amazon, but there's a free copy there. What else is there? Loads of videos of me coaching embodiment, resources on trauma, on meditation, on yoga. And you can also chat to people without going on Facebook or any of that nonsense. So if you want to chat embodiment people, that's there. And it's on the embodimentunlimited.com, all free, and the app available at the App Store and all that good stuff. So if you like this, do check those out.